Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking with my friends and fellow astrologers, Michael J. Morris and Oscar Diaz, about the life and astrology of Meredith Monk, a multimedia artist who we all have been looking at her work. And in Michael's case, Michael has been following her work for decades at this point. And so we wanted to put our heads together and talk about Meredith Monk's life and take a look at her birth chart, which we have a rising sign for. In other words, we know approximately what time she was born. If you want to follow along with the birth chart that we're looking at for Meredith Monk, check the link in the description to astro.com. Note that Meredith Monk says that she is an Aries rising. She's quoted as saying that she's an Aries rising. And so we will be reading her chart using whole sign houses with an Aries rising chart. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation.
So my name is Oscar Moises Diaz. I'm a practicing astrologer. I'm also a poet, a film curator, and a poetry editor at Asphalt Magazine. And yeah, it's really kind of all of those disciplines are like one and the same to me. It's kind of like in that that old tradition of Manilius being like an astrologer and a poet, and like and I think it informs a lot of like how this kind of episode came about too. It's like talking about like most of my clients are creative people, and I think once you make this decision to be some sort of artist, you're kind of saying, well, every moment of my life is like worthy of being art, or like it's like it's a real whole like it's a real like proclaiming of like my life is so enchanted that all of it is can be near, so it's like always really interesting to study astrology through the work of artists. I have a foundation in Hellenistic. I'm also known for kind of working a lot with like parans, these older fixed star techniques, and I mostly do natal work. Yeah, and one of the cool things that I offer are celestial studio visits. So like that's kind of where I work with like filmmakers, writers, musicians, poets, and we kind of workshop creative work, but we do it through astrology and we do it through the chart, and that's like the most fulfilling work for me because it kind of blends everything that I've kind of learned in this life into like one thing.
My name is Michael J. Morris. My pronouns are they, them, their. And I am a consulting astrologer and tarot reader. I am also an artist, primarily working in choreography and performance art. I'm also a writer, an educator, a facilitator. I have a PhD in dance studies, and I've been teaching for the last 12 years at different universities in dance departments, women's and gender studies programs, queer study program, environmental studies. And my work is, I have a consulting practice called Co-Witchcraft Offering, through which I offer natal astrology grounded in the Hellenistic tradition, as well as bringing in some modern techniques, specifically with a growing emphasis on the asteroids, both the major and minor asteroids coming into the practice, as well as tarot readings. And I think of my work as across all of these different practices, astrology and tarot and writing and performance and choreography and teaching and facilitation, as all being different ways of co-creating meaning, of creating with other people, and specifically with an orientation towards personal and collective healing and liberation. And I think I'm so glad that we did this talk in terms of, that we're doing this talk in terms of looking at the life of an artist through astrology, because I very much think of astrology as an artistic practice, and the ways that we generate astrology, that we create meaning, is a way that we are creating from what is found, what is given in the sky, but then we are bringing our creative artistic perspectives to it and making something of what is available to us in the chart, which is already rendering an artistic representation of the sky. And so I think we have a lot to learn about astrology from artists and from queer folks, and the ways in which that expands and elaborates and complexifies the tradition and gives us more ways of understanding astrology, more ways of understanding the archetypal significations from which this tradition functions through the lives of the people who we choose to give our attention to. And so, yeah, I was just really excited to be in conversation with you both.
I know, Oscar, you've been interested in like that kind of generation of musicians in New York. And that's like, I think where it started for us was like, we had like several.
We had big Jupiterian ideas. We were like, we're going to talk about Julius Eastman, John King, Meredith
Julius
Monk.
Eastman performed with Meredith Monk. Do you know that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Well, we were looking at all these kind of queer musicians, composers, who were all kind of hanging out in the same kind of neighborhoods in New York at a certain period, and being like, and I think it came from like an older, maybe probably like a text conversation with Drew of just like, it'd be nice to like do an astrology thing, but also have it be artistic and I come from like a classical music background, and Drew plays piano. Like it was just like, oh, maybe we can like find some musicians or something musical that we're interested in, and kind of bring astrology to it. And then we just started bouncing off names, and we were gonna do this like huge list of people.
We're gonna do like 5 people at once and like somehow bring it all together. I don't know, but then we got a little more like limited, which is probably good.
Yeah. So, and then we were just like, okay, Meredith, because I feel like I knew some stuff about Meredith's practice and work, but not enough. And so I was like, I would love to learn as part of any kind of process that I'm involved in. So I was like, oh, sure, that's the person on our list who I knew least about. So I was like, let's go.
I guess the only two things that I just anecdotally that feel interesting to add is that her mother, Audrey Lois Monk, was actually a professional singer, specifically a radio singer, a singer of popular and classical music under the stage name Audrey Marsh. And she was herself, Meredith Monk's mother was the daughter of professional musicians from her mother's and her grandfather, her father, her mother, and her grandfather, all being Russian Jewish singers and German Jewish singers. And so that's the lineage that they came to the United States, to Philadelphia. And so Meredith Monk grew up in this very like lineage of music and singing and song, and then creates her own version of that, specifically in this interdisciplinary, embodied, experimental, transdisciplinary place of taking the lineage of her family and that context in which she grew up, and then moving it in new directions that are not only new for her and her family, but also for the various disciplines with which she interfaces.
How did you find Meredith, Michael?
I came to her music in college. I think it was my sophomore, junior year of college. I took a dance history course in postmodern dance, and she was active in New York in the postmodern dance movement. She moved to New York right at the end of the Judson Dance Theater, which was really the first group of choreographers in New York from like the early 1960s, like 61 to 64, that were making work at the Cunningham studio and really innovating beyond what folks like Merce Cunningham had done, exploring a really kind of stripped down minimalist formalism in movement vocabulary. So this is like the generation of dancers who put walking and standing still on stage and called it a dance, which was extremely challenging for audiences at the time. And Meredith Monk moved to New York right at the tail end of that. So she wasn't technically part of the Judson Dance Theater, but she started performing with a lot of those artists. And then she was part of a group called the Grand Union that was a contact improvisation, performance improvisation ensemble that grew out of the Judson Dance Theater. And I was just fascinated with the ways in which she was so different than so many of the other postmodern dance choreographers, in that so many people in that period were working in this like stripped down minimalism, formalist approach to movement. And Meredith Monk was bringing in like theatricality and costumes and set design and multimedia in this kind of like total art. I can't remember that German word right now.
Glischenstein, like it's like it starts with a G or something.
Gesamtkunstwerk, something like that.
Yeah.
It means the total artwork, and it's like that earlier 20th century movement in German art that's like bringing together opera and theater and set design and costuming and working and bringing all these different artists together. And Meredith Monk was doing something like that, and so I was curious and interested in her as partly because of the way she was different. And then I was at a Borders Books and Music during that. Did you remember Borders?
Oh my
In
gosh.
Jackson, Mississippi, and I found one of her albums, the album for Atlas, the opera, first like big scale, large opera that she had done. And then I started moving with her music and exploring moving to her music, learning more about her and her biography. Then I ended up choreographing to some of the pieces that she composed on the album Mercy for my senior thesis work in undergrad. And the album Mercy was probably the moment that it was like, oh, this person's changing my life.
Mm.
This music. I remember the first time I was living in Jackson in my first apartment, and I had put on the album. It had arrived while I was in class, and I came home and put it on. I had just made a cup of tea, and the first song came on, and I almost dropped my cup. I felt like I was struck so deeply by something. It felt like recognition. It felt like I know exactly what's being articulated right now, even though
Mm.
it is absolutely not using words.
Right.
In that particular piece on that album, she does use words sometimes, but rarely in this kind of non-verbal, pre-verbal space. And so it was that moment of recognition that really compelled me. Yeah, and then she's just been an abiding, probably my favorite artist of any genre over the last almost 20 years. And then I got to see her perform live in 2016 for the first time. It was actually the day of Donald Trump's inauguration, and she was performing in Michigan. And I was like, I
Mm.
am not fucking giving my energy and attention to this dumpster fire of a political situation. I'm going to go be with the art that gives me a reason to live. And so they were doing On Behalf of Nature at the Power Center in Ann Arbor. And so I went and saw that, and it was one of the closest things I've had to a religious experience in my adulthood, because it was quite literally this voice made flesh. It's like, your voice has been in my life for, at that point, like about 15 years. And then to see her in person and hear her speak in person, see her move in person, see how the company is always moving with the sounds that they are doing, that they're never separable, that the voice is always embodied, the music is always a dance, the dance is always vocalized, and to see how that works in space rather than just listening it or watching it on video um, was another kind of crystalline moment for me in terms of Meredith Monk's work. And somewhere along the way, I guess it was when Impermanence came out, and there was liner notes about Mika dying, her partner dying, was the first time that I knew that she was a lesbian. And there was this kind of thing that happened in that period of life, because I just come out around my freshman year of college as a queer person. And there was this thing that kept happening where artists that I just was so entranced by, years later, I would find out that they were queer in some way. And there was a kind of solidarity in that too, of like, it's not reducible to that moment of recognition being of listening to the album Mercy and feeling that recognition isn't reducible to a queer identity, but that there was something about the ways that she's moved through the world and the ways that she is approaching the world in her work, in the ways that she thinks about the work, and we can get into what that might mean. That does feel distinctly related to a if not a total subversion of identity, definitely the moving into the in between and liminal spaces between kind of concrete categories of social identity, social location, which has a kind of queerness about it already, but then also then to learn that she had 20 years with this partner who then died. That was another moment of feeling like, oh, you're my person. You're one of
Mhm.
my artists, I think.
I think that's really interesting to focus on that idea of the subversion of identity, and how does she achieve that in her work. And I think that it comes back a lot to language and the way that she talks, or language and its absence, or how it's tinkered with, how it's played with in her work. And what's interesting to me about that kind of subversion of language, or the subversion of the categories that language produces, is that she's still interested in universality. Like it's actually like this play with language that she does, this absence and this like return to language, and then this kind of decomposition of language that you hear throughout a piece, where she does use a given word and then it kind of like decays into like more kind of base utterances. it's interesting that like philosophically, she's still interested in this kind of universal form of human expression. And I think that's a very daring move in the context, like the historical and social context that she's working in, where, you know, where universality is like this thing that's supposed to be kind of suspected of being a on the, it's like universality is working on the behalf of like capital and, you know, this kind of teleological view of history, and that she's kind of moving us into this more historical orientation to creative expression, and trying to find these human experiences that are universal somehow and that you can express outside of language. And I just think that's so interesting. Maybe we can reflect on that idea through her chart in some way. I'm curious if that's something that strikes you both as like an important kind of theme for her, or if you've thought about that.
I think maybe arriving to a similar place a different way. I feel like she, and this is maybe like an eighth house thing too, is like, well, again, I like quote this philosopher in like every podcast I'm on. So this is like my Byung-Sul Han moment. But it's like this philosopher who talks about like there's this great book called The Disappearance of Rituals, and we'll talk about how the space of a festival is very unique. You actually can't be productive, in that kind of capital P Marxist way at a festival. It's like it asks you to surrender to a different type of feeling of time. It's kind of like life intensifies in the middle of a festival, and it kind of is this place that humans humans love to come together, and so like a festival can kind of like create and open that space that's a different time. And I think what I find so exciting about her work is that kind of gathering, congregational, ritualistic kind of thing. I mean, people write that about her work all the time. It's like, oh, I feel like I've just stepped into something else, and it's totally about the atmosphere. And I think, it's like, life does intensify within like a ritual context. It's like, oh, we can actually risk here, like we can play here in ways that an assembly line would not allow us to, or like this like acceleration of time, which is kind of like this kind of like smoothing of time. Like we're stuck in scrolling, we're stuck in this kind of place where we can't pin down. But how is the space of a festival, the space of a gathering, the space of musicians playing with each other, a place of sustainment, of being suspended, and I think that's like an eighth house thing. I mean, I really love the ancient Greek epikataphora. It's like, we're descending down, being casting down to the underworld. I think that's like pretty close to what Firmicus, if my memory is great today, kind of calls the eighth house. And I love that. Yeah, it is kind of like this transitory place in the chart. It's not the angle, so it's a dark house. It's hidden away. And what can we do in the dark? One of my colleagues and someone who I consider a mentor, even Emily Russo, and I, we like do these like astrology workshops, and just like I'll never forget this one offhanded thing that she said during our eighth house class, where she was like, like the eighth house is like the nightclub of the chart, and I like screenshotted that or like in my brain, and actually she wrote it in the chat, and so it was actually like a screenshot, and I was just like, oh yeah, like the lights are dimmer here. There's like a we can gamble here, we can risk here, we can play together here. It's like alliances can happen here. I don't know, that was a huge snowball of a Sagittarius Mercury thing, but I think connecting it back to this like universality thing, it's kind of like a lot of her work feels like it's going back to something that's before.
I have so many thoughts about what you just said, Oscar, and what you said, Drew. I guess one place I'll start is following that theme of subversion and subversivity that we see in the work. And that's actually a way that she talks about the work, is it being intentionally subversive or even disruptive of certain assumptions of various forms. the
Mhm.
perhaps in the first sense, the discreteness of form, that disciplines are separate from one another, and that's like fundamental to her work, whether we call that multimedia or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. The language has changed a lot over the decades, but that from the start, she is not assuming that these disciplines are separate from one another. So that's one of the ways in which it's subversive, but also things like the ways in which she's questioned the frontal presentation of the proscenium. And so a lot of her early work being site-specific, multi-location work that disrupts or troubles the relationship between the viewer and the performer, such that like even in some pieces, the performers are actually quite stationary in some sort of situation or location, and the audience is moving around, is perambulating in some way. And we could think about that related. I think about and some of this could relate to some transits too, but
Oh yeah.
some of her third house placements, and having Uranus in the third house and this kind of disruptive, revolutionary, radical change related to location and proximity, related to quite literally moving around multiple local locations as part of the work. But also things like that we've already started to touch on, like the assumption that songs have words. And so in all of these ways, she's like disrupting assumptions about the work, but also, and this maybe brings us more towards the eighth house, I'll call it a stellium, that we can see in this chart, that Oscar was gesturing towards. She talks about the work, especially her more recent work, the last like 4 or 5 large projects, as the voice articulating things and qualities and feelings and energy that really can't be put into words, giving voice to what she describes as the shades of feelings and emotions in the cracks between the feelings and emotions that we recognize. And she talks about especially that these more recent works as being about things that not only can't be put into words, but can't even really be known or understood. Things like mercy or impermanence or art speaking on behalf of nature or the more than human world. And that with each project, she's setting up this thing that's like in some way impossible. It's like totally elusive. And she talks quite a lot, really from the 80s forward, about the intuitive quality of her work, that she is when her work is working at its best, she's following the felt sense of where it goes. And I think that's such an eighth house thing, 12th house thing. And that's something that Kelly Surtees says about the eighth house and the 12th house, is like in these, what we call the dark house, sometimes called the dark house, of the places that are in aversion to the ascendant. We don't rely on the same senses that we usually rely on in order to make sense of something, in order to make meaning of something. So she gives I mean, similar to the nightclub, but like the lights being down or even in the dark. What do you do in the dark? Well, first you slow down because you don't know where you're going. And you start to tune into other senses. You touch and you feel your way through the dark. You start listening really closely to the ambient noise in order to navigate where are you getting close to a wall and things like that. And so this intuitive felt sense that she describes in her work, I think we could see that relating to this beautiful exalted moon in Taurus and the intuitive qualities that the moon speaks to, but also these heavy placements in Scorpio in the eighth house, this going deeply into spaces that you can't see clearly, the things that, as she said, that you maybe can't even know or understand, let alone articulate, let alone put into words. And so we can see some of those themes, I think, coming in relation to that. And I have lots and lots of other thoughts about the eighth house, but I guess I'll pause there and hand it back over to y'all.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that her luminaries are in the second and eighth houses. And Oscar, you were gesturing to this, of those being like the gates of Hades. You didn't use that specific language, but I think you used the Greek for it, which I hadn't heard before, so that's cool. And so the gates of Hades being these transition points between day and night. And so the eighth house, where she has all these Scorpio placements, is this transition from day into night. And then the moon, which she has in the second house, and the second house being this place of transition from night to day. And so I think it's interesting to maybe reflect on the lights in her chart being in those places of transition of light, that she's also interested in these like liminal positions of like movement and music, and the way that a space can speak, and troubling the perceptive. I mean, when we think about light, we think about perception, right? troubling the sight as like the only way of perceiving, or listening as the only way of perceiving, but that all of these things come together in uh, in a way that I think she's exploring. This chart is really like so much about the third and the eighth, and you gestured, Michael, um, to the third house with Uranus there, and the importance of her work in terms of like a local space or an immediate environment, what is proximate, and how one moves and ambulates around that space, and how her work takes people around town, or the audience is like itself moving. And the ruler of her 10th house is that Saturn in the third. And so her work being known for this kind of this movement, right? This ambulation, and also for this oldness and this ritualistic sense, which is also a third house topic. I think of the third house in terms of like it's the joy of the moon, right? And so it's these embodied memories, and the way that she talks about exploring the memory of her body, or the maybe not even necessarily the memory, but just like what her body knows, like that is so much a part of her artistic exploration and expression. And I think it's interesting then that her third house jumps to the eighth, with Mercury ruling her third and being in the eighth. And so she is in Scorpio, no less. And so it's like these mysterious kind of this quality of like mystery, and needing to get underneath something. She has all of these. She talks so much about like directionality, actually, like going down. Like, how do we worship in a downward way instead? Why do we worship up? Is something that she says in a podcast that Michael sent. And I think that's so interesting to think about. That the movement around, and that kind of like spinning quality, as well as a downward exploration.
To jump in on that,
Yeah,
that aroundness, and also the up and downness, like we see at least in two key moments in her career, in terms of Juice being performed, one of her early pieces when she was like 24, being performed at the Guggenheim, which is this like large spiraling architecture that and performers were moving up and down the slope, the path through the gallery. But then also the more recent piece, I have the date for it, Songs of Ascension, that she did with Anne Hamilton in, let's see, when was
2008,
Juice?
I think.
Juice was in 1969. And then, yeah, Songs of Ascension, 2008, in Anne Hamilton's tower in California, which is like this, there are these double helix staircases inside of it that don't meet one another. And so this question of like, as you were saying, like, why do we worship up? And that's definitely part of the piece, is ascension and like moving upward, but in as much as it's moving upward, it's also moving downward. And that feels like, and I love that you brought the attention to the uncovering, the going down into the hidden, which I feel like is like very Scorpio stuff, but that brings up this quote that I was thinking of, that's from an interview that she gave in 1984 in this feminist art magazine called Heresies. And the interviewer asks her about archaeology and how she sees archaeology at work in her creative practice. And she says, well, you know, Freud always talks about archaeology as a metaphor for psychoanalysis. And I've never really been conscious of using archaeology. Admittedly, this was 1984. So at that moment, she wasn't conscious of using archaeology as a subject matter. And she says, until the piece Recent Ruins, where I was using it as a theme. And this is the part I was thinking of when you were talking, Drew. She says, but I've always been aware of trying to uncover things that have always existed. I always feel that if I'm working well, that the form exists, and it's just a matter of finding it and allowing it to tell me what to do. When I feel like I'm working really well, that's what the process feels like, more than it feels like me inventing. And that's really like archaeology. It's sort of like discovering. It's discovery as a mode of creation. You could say it's an older idea of creation than the way post-industrial people think of creation. Because I love the idea of archaeology, that you have a civilization, and then over that is another civilization, and over that is another civilization, and over that is another civilization. And it's incredible. And I think that really speaks to that third eighth house connection that you're pointing to. And it's profoundly Scorpio, I think, to be uncovering and going deeper and deeper what's beneath the thing, and beneath that thing, and beneath that thing, to discover what exists in the depth. I feel like that brings up some strong Scorpio stuff, but also there's this minor asteroid in her chart that I'm super interested in. She has the several minor asteroids in her chart that I'm super interested in, but she has the asteroid Clio conjunct her exalted Jupiter in Cancer in the fourth house. And Clio was the Greek muse of history, of oral tradition, but also written traditions of retaining the memories of a culture. And so there's something about the brilliance and abundance of this really beautiful Jupiter in the fourth house was just already the place of not only land, but lineage and ancestry and ancestors and going down to the root of the chart. And then in that place, she has the muse of history. And so there's a relationship there that I'm thinking about as well in terms of both this third, eighth house relationship and the uncovering that we see of Scorpio, but also this signature of the muse of history and this fascination or this interest of going deeper into what has existed in the past, and even as she says, has pointed to in other places, what has always existed, that's part of what she's curious about. And so I'm just making a little correlation there between the minor asteroid Clio and its conjunction to one of the most auspicious planets in her chart, being Jupiter in this angular house in its exaltation and so on.
Yeah, maybe adding on to the third house thing, right? It's like, the third house and also the ninth are places where dreams live. And it's also, right, they're houses of divination, that access. And so I also think about like the third house as like a rehearsal space.
Mm.
It's also like a community house. It's like right, the neighborhood, but actually like who's actually surrounding you. And so for me, this third house in this chart is really like a really deep well. It's kind of like, and then even looking at this eighth house, like, okay, I might be butchering this, I don't know how many planets you technically need to have like that formation of an assembly, but it is like a lot of planets congregating in that eighth. And so there's something about like the group or something. I mean, and underneath her moon in the parans is a fixed star called Auresha underneath her Taurus moon. And when Auresha is underneath the moon like that, it always talks about, there's this delineation of like, well, Auresha first, the fixed star is the sacred knot in the sky. So it's a star of mysticism. And it's kind of like the feeling of like taking blue and yellow and making green. It's often found in kind of charts of people like, right, knotting things together, but it has that transformation moment, right? It's like taking two things that don't seem like they connect and then making the third thing. So it's like there's an inventor kind of vibe there too. And with the moon, it becomes about people. It's like being able to bring together people. And so I really kind of like love that also says like, Auresha to the moon is like there is a network there. And then we also see it mirrored across from the eighth. And so maybe that opposition is kind of like, it's like she's making work with people. And I really love that.
I remember you mentioned briefly like her Jupiter. Both of you have mentioned her Jupiter.
Yeah.
Did you want to go on that?
Yes. The fourth house as an archive, right? Like the subterraneous place, it holds. I mean, it's so much time is there, right? And the whole thing about archaeology sounds amazing. And something she said, she kind of like loves to work with fragments. Sometimes it's just kind of like two little maybe bars of music, and then really kind of making that go really far. And I think if this Jupiter, right, it's in the third decan, which is like the image of these cups overflowing of Cancer, right? It's like that's like the image in Austin Coppock's book. It's like cups overflowing. And so it's like, how do we that's when we work with archives, when we work with shards, it's kind of like, how do we tease out a cloud of virtualities from this very small thing? You know what I mean? It's like, and so maybe that Jupiter is like there to do that, is to kind of find the piece and then kind of expand it and make it bigger. And I think that's kind of like a really beautiful thing. It reminds me of like, old pottery or parts of like ancient slabs, like even like the poetry of Sappho. It's like those brackets are so generous. It's like so it's like finding any way to kind of make or engage with these like small pieces that we kind of are digging from like a very subterraneous place.
I think she talks about fragments, and just as an example of, I mean, one of the things that's most striking to me about like when she does use language is the way that that language gets like decomposed in the course of her performance, and maybe it's like decomposed and then like tied together again in just the sound. Like there's some kind of process there of like undoing and redoing. And what you're saying about fragments makes me think about this quote, which I think comes back to like Saturn in the third, and these forms of worship, and this idea of like of movement, and how bodies relate to each other within a space, and collaboration, and these kinds of like third, eighth house dynamics that we're seeing. So she said, this is from the On Being podcast, which we'll definitely link in the description. She says, ancient worship forms or early theater were really about weaving together music and storytelling and movement, ritual movement. And so there are precedents in ancient times. It's just in the Western European tradition where these things got separated. And I think I had this instinct that doing this work like this in this way was also a way of healing the kind of fragmentation and specialization that had developed in the world that we're living in. And so it seems like through, like, she is interested in these fragments, and I think she is interested in like in like an archive, like you're saying, Oscar, like an archive of fragments, but also like trying to like unite that that archival well, and put the pieces back together, which is a very Jupiterian thing, especially Jupiter in Cancer. Like, what is the original union of things? Like, what is the meaning? What is the universal kind of what is universal about these fragments? How do they tie together? And so I think that all of those things that you're saying about Jupiter and archives really resonate with how she's working with fragments and trying to pull them together.
That third house as like maybe the rehearsal studio, you know, it's like where the meeting place for this like community of singers who, right, she doesn't make work alone. Like it's kind of made with others. And and that's also, that's like maybe a third house thing, but it's also an eighth house thing, you know. I some, you know, I have clients, and when they have like prominent eighth house energy, I always kind of start by kind of turning it around, you know. It's like, because everyone wants to come in and be like, you know, sometimes the eighth house gets fetishized in ways that I'm like, oh, well, you know, there's so much more. And so I always like to surprise people. I'm like, have you thought about the eighth house as like the house of collaboration? Or the eighth house is like the house of sharing? And they're like, whoa. And so I actually do this in my consultations. I start by like, when we talk about the eighth house, regardless of how the eighth house is working in the chart, I always kind of quote this this poet, Edmund Yavez, who's a Jewish Egyptian poet writing after the Holocaust. And he has this book called The Book of Shares. And I just really quickly wanted to share a quote because it's kind of how I introduce the eighth house to people in consultation. So here it goes. It says, as we approach sharing, let us ask, what belongs to me? Balance sheet of a life ratified by death. Whatever exists has no existence unless shared. Possessions under seal are lost possessions. At first sight, giving, offering yourself in order to receive an equivalent gift in return would seem to be ideal sharing, but can all be divided? Can a feeling, a book, a life be shared entirely? On the other hand, if we cannot share all, what remains and will always remain outside sharing? What has never, at the heart of our possessions, been ours? And what if all we can share is the vital desire to share, our only means of escape from solitude, from nothingness? And so, I mean, that's like a huge paragraph, but I think those are all eighth house questions. And, you know, I always like to make, you know, I don't want to make the eighth house boring to people either. It's like a finance house, you know, just like the second house. But I think we can take words like debt, spending, accrual, accumulations, weighing of things, taxes, and actually make that more open, right, than just about money, but about like how we relate to the people in our lives and in the world, right? And so I think, you know, when I share that Edmund Yavez quote about sharing and possessions, I'm like, we can really figure that out together with others in the eighth house. It's like intimate activity. And actually, that brings me to the concept of like the eighth house being a place of generosity. It's like, it's like the light is changing, the street lights are coming on, we're about to change sect, it's a whole new world, a whole new kind of luminary in charge, like, so we're on our way, but it's kind of like there's some accounting there that has to happen. And I think of Meredith Monk and so much of her work as kind of back to what people always say, she's like, oh, she's like a futurist, but she's like kind of ancient, or like, there's also this kind of like, she's contemporary, but there's also this old stuff. And so it's very natural for me to think of her kind of in line, in kind of this grander, bigger, funerary poetic tradition. I think about Simonides, this old Greek poet who was known for his poems on tombstones. And I think about tombstones in relation to the eighth house. It's like Simonides lived at this point in history where coinage was actually starting to be introduced more in Greece. It was, they used to have a gift system called xenia, right? It was a hospitality gift economy. And he's one of the first poets that has to figure out what it means for someone to finally pay you for your poetry. Like the village would like invite you and feed you, and you would just sing and write verse, and they, it's like they kept you close. So yeah, there's kind of like accounting for stuff. And then I really I don't know, I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in, right, tombstones. That's the long way around for that. But right, so we started taking money for poems on tombstones, and then Simonides, like, sure, gets like a rich person, maybe a senator dies, like, oh, you have 20 lines of verse, go ahead, do your thing, write me the thing. But what do you do when your client, it needs a poem for a tombstone, and they're poor, and you can only have one line on that tombstone? The great thing about the Greek language is that so many words can be flipped or can mean multiple things. And so Simonides is, considered a master funerary poet, because he was able to kind of give you one line on a tombstone that actually is like 5 verses or something. Like, he was able to make like multiple out of like the tiny restraint, kind of the shard. And so I relate that to kind of a lot of what Meredith Monk's practices too, is like, that's a form of accounting, right? Like, he's like, I only have like these set letters that I can use in the space, so what am I going to do? How can I expend here? Someone said it earlier, the word impossible. And I was like, oh, George Bataille, like, sorry, got to be George Bataille right now. And so, yeah, George Bataille, and the idea of like these notions of expenditure, and kind of, George Bataille was like, he would call many things that, but he would call like poetry that. Bataille also thought of like poetry as like creation by means of loss. And so I'm just kind of like interested in the eighth house as places to do that, and kind of find the risk again, and and really kind of go for it. And I feel like a lot of like the vocal work is kind of this expenditure of just like the vocal pattern. It's kind of like, how many ways can I go from these 2 notes, and kind of keep that in the air. It's even moments where like there's like it, like, like the voice like follows like the staccato, like there's a chasing, there's a running, and it's like,
it feels like an urgency sometimes.
Yeah, it's like urgent. Yeah,
and I think like Mars in the 8th, like I mean, yeah, that sense of urgency definitely feels there, like but she also has this kind of patience in the way that it all comes together. I don't know, Michael, do you have any thoughts on this whole 8th house discussion?
I have so many thoughts about this, about things. The first is, I love that you're bringing in collaboration as an 8th house signification, Oscar. I think I was in an 11th house perfection year, and the ruler of my 11th is what perfection year was I in? That anyway, the 8th house was getting brought in And that was when I started hearing Chani Nicholas using collaboration as a primary signification for the eighth house.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, it's extrapolating in the same way that you were, of like, if this is the place of shared resources, what does it mean to share resources? What does it mean to be in a practice or process of sharing? And that's collaboration. That's like creating things together that we can't create on our own. And so I love hearing that circulate and hearing that resonate with from the other sites, other astrologers too. There was a couple of places that I wanted to share some quotes that map onto things that you both were saying. The first was around this like local community, this like being not only in collaboration in the eighth house, but in the third house of being in practice with people. And this is again from that 1984 interview. She's talking about the shift from large scale work to smaller scale work. And she said, as I'm getting older, I'm wanting to work smaller. I guess I don't need that kind of size to feel my power. It could be that sometimes in your life, you have to have that kind of expansive energy to be able to include a lot. Now I'm more interested in the kind of depth rather than a breadth. And she says, like, in the days that I did those big pieces with large groups, it was a real communal kind of thing. People would come and their kids would be in the show and that kind of thing, which I loved very much. And then she goes into a whole discussion of starting to work with a group of people, like a small group of people over decades, this same group of people, such that they, which became the house, which was one of her early ensembles. And this shift into this more intimate space of collaborative creation, of bringing in these fragments into the studio and seeing where they could go, these like little measures of things that she had built and explored, and then distributing them differently and toning them differently, finding who could do what at the same time or in canons, et cetera, like it really building the composition out in the group idea. And then I also wanted to speak to the fragments piece that Oscar brought in that then you picked up as well, Drew, which is something that she talks about specifically in terms of the multimedia nature of her work. She says, I think for me, it's a psychic necessity, integrating a lot of different elements that I was interested in and was always interested in. And she named specifically dance and music being things that she was always interested in. And she said, bringing them together became a way of integrating myself, that I could use as much of myself as I can. And that's always been how I felt. You should use anything you have. And I feel like there's maybe some inflections of the Saturn, Uranus, and Gemini here, but also the Moon in Taurus and that second house stellium in the eighth of in a more modern kind of psychological context. We might understand these places of, I mean, sort of in the direction that Oscar was gesturing towards, that these are places of resources, but use this language she's offering of use anything that you can. In terms of yourself, bringing more of yourself in, bringing more of other people in, and kind of building from these fragments into something that is more integrated. Because actually she talks about, and this comes more from, or it kind of feels inflected from her Buddhism practice, that part of what she hopes for her work is actually relief from the fragmenting nature of society, that in this kind of late industrial, late stage capitalist world, there's so much acceleration and fragmentation that she hopes that part of the experience that people have in experiencing her work and being with her work is the quieting of the discursive mind and the reintegration of all that gets broken apart in our day-to-day lives. And so we can see how that's kind of modeled in the work of bringing together all of these fragments and integrating them into something that does something that no one of those fragments could do on their own.
Maybe one direction for thinking about the eighth house in her chart and in her life is, I mean, just the way that she experienced loss and the way that did lead to her creating this album Impermanence. And Oscar, you mentioned, I forget exactly what you said, but it was like a loss as a way of creation or something like that.
Yeah, that George Bataille believes that like poetry is a means of creation of loss, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Through loss, yeah.
Yeah, and so like these experiences of loss that then become a means of sharing that experience. And maybe I was also thinking about the eighth house in terms of catharsis, not in like a boring Aristotelian way, but you know, the way that she describes this album Impermanence is that she wanted to like go directly into grief and experience it like in its fullness. And I thought that was so powerful, and it makes me think about her Mars being in like a very dignified position in her 8th house, ruling her ascendant, and how she does seem to be interested in these experiences of loss and creating from that place. So I just thought that was very resonant, Oscar, and also the way that she is playing with language also in that space, and like how to express loss through sound and through language, but not really through language, and like how can we try through language, but it's never really fully there.
Multimedia thing leads me to think about yes, the Saturn, Uranus in the 3rd, and then of course then Saturn ruling the midheaven. I did want to bring in this quote by Mary Ruffel. I asked my friend, the translator, what was the first known act of translation in the history of mankind. His answer was probably something into or out of Egyptian. I thought about this for a while and ventured a certainty. No. I said, it was when a mother heard her baby babble or cry, and I had to decide and had to decide in an instant what it meant. And so then I'm thinking about that in relationship to Monk showing up at the rehearsal space and being like, here's my 2 bars of music, and then people starting to take that in their body, which is like and reproducing it and changing it, and that's a form of translation. And I feel like translation is creation, right? And it's also like related to these 8th house things of like, right, how do you like take something from one language into the next? Like obviously certain words are going to fall off, or certain kind of meanings will have to fall, be prioritized for it to kind of pass through. It's just like, right, these gates in the chart, the 2nd and the 8th house, it's like, debris and kind of accumulations, and I Monk talks so much about like actually needing a lot of like kind of drumming up a lot of like material to then kind of work through. It's kind of like, and so I feel like that's like an 8th house thing, like these kind of accumulating of debts even, or something, and so then I kind of think of Herman Morris talking more about like something I mentioned earlier about like that gift reciprocity economic system called Xenia, where he defines Xenia as like the aim of the gift economy is accumulation for deaccumulation. The gift economy is above all a debt economy, where the actors strive to maximize outgoings. The system can be described as one of, quote, alternating disequilibrium, unquote, where the aim is never to have debts, quote, paid off, unquote, but to preserve a situation of personal indebtedness. So there's something there about like, right, that kind of intense 8th house relationship sometimes of like, oh, we're in this together, right? And kind of like that kind of being all in and kind of having to figure it out together. But also, the thing about that is like recognition. It's like, I recognize you, right? Like the Xenia thing would be like, you would get like a clay thing and you would break it in half, and you would keep half, I would keep half. And if I ever needed, help, I would show up to your farm or something, and I would just, I wouldn't even say anything. I would just show you my half, and you would recognize me. And so how, I'm also thinking of the 8th house as like those kind of things, and kind of being indebted together, and then having to kind of do this accounting for together.
I love all the connections that you're making, Oscar, in terms of really generating a deeper understanding of how we can make meaning of the 8th house through constellating these different references and following these trails of what does it mean to follow this trail of the gift, and what does it mean to follow this trail of the dimness of light, and how do we follow this trail of accumulation and deaccumulation, and what do each of these pathways or these trails teach us about the 8th house, about the astrology. I'm thinking a lot more about the death part of it, in terms of specifically if we do want to spend some time looking at impermanence specifically, and the loss of her partner. And it was in an interview A little bit after that, after her partner died with, I think this was with the Believer magazine.
Mm.
She's actually talking about her Buddhism practice and the kind of misunderstandings of Buddhism. And she says it's not like everything is going to be wonderful. Buddhism isn't that anyway. That's a big misunderstanding. Everybody thinks, oh, if you meditate, you're going to be so nice and everything's going to be fine, or you'll be happy all the time and you're going to be smiling all the time. And it's not like that at all. It's actually the opposite. It's that you become much more aware of the edge and you actually lean into your pain, which I feel like is such a not only an eighth house stellium thing, but
Marshall.
Mars ruling the ascendant in the eighth house. Like what is guiding and directing your life? I'm leaning into the pain. And she says, but there's a difference between pain and suffering. The pain exists in life and it's very much a part of life. Having lost a partner 10 years ago, I realized that my grieving was what millions of people were going through simultaneously. And she goes on to talk about that more, but that's the part that I was connecting to um, what Oscar was talking about to the circulation of relations through this gift economy, through the debt that brings us into a situation of being bound to one another in some way, sharing something in one way and in some way, and the grief as a shared experience
Mm-hmm.
being something that she's really clearly articulating both in terms of her spiritual practice but also her artistic practice, which she has said multiple times are not separate from one another. But I'm actually quite interested that this is not new. It didn't just start with Mika's death. That actually, she says, Deborah, or the interviewer asks her about being a young artist. And so these are two different quotes. They're a little long-ish, but I think they're really evocative in terms of both her Aries ascendant, but also these eighth house placements. And she says, I was pretty tough as a young artist. She said, I was tough, young, fierce. I was a tough, young, fierce thing trying to do my art. I was determined, and it was hard to make my way in the world. I thought I had to really fight my way through to be able to express myself in the ways I wanted to. And it's like, if that's not an Aries talking, then I'm not sure. She says, especially as a female artist at that time, I don't like to use the word struggle, but to this day, every time I begin a piece, I am scared to death. In the beginning, it's like flailing about in the dark, trying to find what this little idea could be that you could build from. So that's the struggle. That struggle is always part of it. And I just love how clearly Aries, a lot of the drive, the determination, the fierceness, the I've got to do it my way, but also this like every time I start a piece, I'm scared to death. That death is like evoked there, even metaphorically, but as we'll see, is also literally. And then the flailing in the dark being such an evocative correlation with the eighth house. She says, I was fierce about my own vision, and there was just no choice for me. It was like a choiceless choice. That was something I felt like I had to fight for, die for, which I still do to a certain extent. But after so many years, it's really more that it takes all my energy just to make each piece. And I just try to stay on my path, and that's enough. And this thing of the work being the art that she makes, the work that she does being something that she has to fight for, Mars ruling the ascendant, but also to die for. And it still feels that way after all these decades, being just a really clear correlation with Mars ruling the ascendant in the eighth house feels pretty evocative. There's some more things that I could bring in terms of these eighth house significations if we want to stay with that a little bit longer. But
Yeah, I think the thing that she talks about in one of the interviews is in terms of that experience of of loss and grieving. She reflects on that process as speaking to the fact that there was something meaningful and that the loss of something and the grieving for something points to the meaning and the attachments and like the imbrications of our lives together and meeting each other. And she actually says that she's grateful for this experience, which is an incredibly powerful thing to say, that like losing your partner of 22 years could be something that you're grateful for. But I think that's a place where we see the connection. Not everybody is going to experience their eighth house this way. I think that's a place where we see the connection of her Jupiter trining all of her eighth house placements, where there's this greater acceptance of loss because of this reverence for the past, maybe, and the past being able to live on in these other ways, and the creative work being like Oscar was talking about, tombstones, and this way that things live on even after they're no longer earthly, and they descend to the underworld, and they still live in some way.
Right, that like communal aspect is so important. I mean, I'm looking now at the chart I have, and I'm like, oh, there's Antisha between that Saturn and that Jupiter. I use like
Yeah.
a little bit of a wide range, but Jupiter is actually doing so much in this chart, right? There's that trine to the eighth. It's the benefic of Sact, right? I mean, you know, it makes me think about well, for example, like that album, weren't the singers from a hospice?
Okay, so just a little bit of timeline. So Mika Van Hoek, her partner, died November 13th, 2022. Then a couple of years
2002.
later, 2002. Yeah. And then a couple of years later in 2004 was when she did the Impermanence Project. And that was the working with the people who were in this kind of hospice, approaching death, terminally ill program. And that's where she developed a lot of the music. And then the stage production of Impermanence was with her company that was performed in 2006 was when it was premiered. And I have some like exact dates for that if we want to talk about like some interesting timing things that happen. So yeah, that's the kind of building blocks of it. And then the album came later after the stage production.
Well, I love that like she went to a community to do this with the recording of her lover, right, of Mika, right, and kind of wove out that entire album there, you know, in the hospice center. I mean, it reminds me of all these of these recent films I've seen by the Italian filmmaker Cecilia Mangini. And so there's this one film called Sandali from 1960 where she's going to this Greco community in southern Puglia in Italy to document these mourning rituals that the women in that village have. And there's this moment where, like, you know, one of the women on camera says, when we are gone, that lamentations will be gone too. And it made me really think about, like, wow, like people can be keepers of certain chants or words that actually open up a space for mourning and community grieving. You know what I mean? It's like the entire film, you see that like no one in that community isolates the processing of death. Like all these women will come to your house and cry with you, you know, this like will be there with you, you know. And then like, how is that eighth house, fourth house? And then, you know, but it's also like, right, they're openers of this ritual space. And, you know, that being such a like important kind of you know, thing that like kind of needs to be kept alive or kind of thought about, even with like Saturn and Aquarius right now, is like, you know, how much like the privatization of stress, as like Mark Fisher would say, is like such a problem. It's like we need those spaces where we kind of are coming together to deal with grief, and I don't think we have a lot of those. And I love that the work that Monk is doing through this album, and especially, you know, with this recording of Mika, is kind of that, you know,
that work being connected to hospice. I mean, the fact that her Jupiter rules her 12th house, and it has this supportive relationship with like the dead and the dying in the 8th house, where there's a trine there. It's almost like she is this figure, this artist whose work is to like help people pass over in some way, and help the living live on, and help the dying continue to be in these supportive ways. There's something very kind of mystical and esoteric and for lack of a better word, witchy about her chart. That it feels like these rituals that she's doing in her art are they come from somewhere, and they are doing something with respect to life and death.
Right. And also like that exalted Jupiter, right, being connected to that ninth house, which I think is totally like, right, large ceremony,
Mhm.
right? Like the
Yeah.
big thing. And also I think that Jupiter's aiming really high. And it's like, maybe, through these vocal extended vocal techniques, it's like, well, what other way would it be? Than to go these extremities with the voice and kind of like really reach, yeah, I love that, Drew. Yeah, that's amazing.
Have a couple of thoughts about things you all just said. In terms of Oscar, you were talking about the not having places to grieve communally or to bring grief back into community. Makes me think of there was a talk that Judith Butler gave um, at a conference or a symposium about Alfred Whitehead's work, and it was actually in the Q&A. She goes on. Someone asks her a question about life and the becoming of life, and she somehow it leads back to death, and she starts reflecting. Judith Butler is a Jewish philosopher, and of course Meredith Monk is coming from multiple Jewish lineages as well. Um, and Judith Butler starts reflecting on the Kaddish, the prayer of the dead, and she said she always thought that the Kaddish was about grieving the dead, but when you actually translate it, it's a celebration of life. It is, and it's something that you pray together, that the Kaddish is a weaving of you back into community, into the world, into life, so that in the moment of loss and grief, what you pray for or how you pray is to be brought back into the community of the living. And so that's just an association that came to mind. In terms of the Jupiter and the ninth house, there's this beautiful place that she talks about this, and I'll see if I can find it in my notes, or maybe I'll just talk, and if I find it in my notes, it's fine. Where she, oh, there it is, where she's talking about extended vocal technique and the ways that people perceive it. And she says, I have worked very directly with my own voice and body. And when you do that, and you're not just staying within the Western vocal tradition, you come up with sounds within your own vocal instrument that could be termed transcultural. So she doesn't really, she's really clear on this. She very intentionally does not study music from other places. But that if we each go deeply, or hardly even Western music anymore, but if we go deeply into our own voice, into our own bodies, we activate possibilities that connect to all kinds of places. And she says, its use and my way of using it is something that I've discovered from my own voice, yet sometimes it can make people have a memory of other cultures. And she says, you become part of what I call the world vocal family. Within one voice is the whole world. And I'm making a connection between Jupiter already being the benefic sect in its own bounds and exalted, and that being like this abundance and expansion and moreness, but also the transcultural voice of the whole world in its rulership of the ninth. But it's also conjunct this beautiful little asteroid called Polyhymnia, and Polyhymnia was the muse of the hymn, of the sacred song. And so it's one of the places where I see voice really clearly articulated in her chart, alongside some Mercury placements that we could talk about in terms of communication and expression and the activation of the voice. So the Polyhymnia being conjunct Jupiter in the fourth house, um, and that being related to the fact that, or we could relate that to the fact that she comes from 4 generations of singers, of musicians, and so there's this lineage down in terms of the expansion and the abundance of Jupiter, that the richness of this placement goes down into her own lineage, but also, as you said, Oscar, it ruling the ninth, it's reaching up high or reaching out far as well in terms of the world vocal family that I think is quite interesting. There was some stuff that I was thinking about in terms of Mika's death and impermanence, and the ways in which that shows up in that work. But actually, she says in a different interview that Deborah Jowett is talking and says, like, in effect, about the work. In effect, it's saying that beyond all this speed and this energy and some of these bad vibes in the world, there's something internal and enduring. And Monk replies, I think that most of my work says that in some way or another. The theme of death and rebirth seems to recur from time to time in the work. And so we see that, like, that she's sort of been thinking about these themes all along. And what I find it interesting in terms of timing, is that when Mika died, Monk was was 59. She was in a 12th house perfection year. So already there's this themes of separation, of grief, of the feelings that we cannot bear, the things that we often repress or suppress because we simply can't hold them. They're too painful, that we sometimes associate with the 12th house. And the ruler of the 12th is in the 4th, which is, of course, traditionally one of the places of endings and of death. If we think of that, I think that's more of an Egyptian reading of the chart, where the ascendant is early life, the midheaven is the midlife, the descendant is the waning years of life, and then the IC, or the 4th house, the subterranean place, is the place of endings and death. And so the ruler of the 12th house is in the 4th, and that's being activated in a 12th house perfection year. She was also in her second Saturn return at that time. And on the exact day that Mika died, Venus, who's the ruler of the 7th house, was retrograde at 1 degree Scorpio in the 8th house. And I would not for anyone watching this video, I wouldn't necessarily say the ruler of the 7th in the 8th by transit is enough to describe the loss of the partner, but that within this larger context of being in a 12th house perfection year, the ruler of the 12th being in the 4th and in her second Saturn return, one of Saturn's traditional associations being both longevity but also death, that all of those significations kind of gather around this particular event in her life. And what's so lovely is that when the Impermanence stage production happened in 2006, which premiered, at least as far as I could track down, the earliest production performance I could find of it was at BAM in New York on November 1st through 5th in 2006. And so at that point, Meredith Monk was was 63. She was in a Cancer 4th house perfection year. And so the perfection came to the ruler that was activated at the time of Mika's death. And when the perfection came to the ruler, this work that she had been doing in this community in the UK with people who were facing terminal illness, death, and dying comes to culmination and comes to the stage. And of course, and then at that same moment by transit, she's in her progressed full moon phase at that time as well. And then by transit, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter are all back in Scorpio in her 8th house. And so there's just this beautiful, what gets shaken or shattered during this 12th house perfection year comes together by the time that she's in the 4th house perfection year, activating that really well-placed, cohesive, exalted Jupiter, but also the progressed full moon coming to this moment of culmination in terms of that timing technique. And then all of these planets assembling once again, including Jupiter, added to Mars, Sun, Venus, and Mercury who are there natally. Adding Jupiter to that mix by transit is that's what's happening in the sky when impermanence comes to the stage. I mean, I looked at timing techniques for most of her work, not all of her work, but most of it. The only other thing that I think is really interesting is also not only other thing, there are minor things, but that was the one that was like astrology together. But also during her second Saturn return was when she took vows in terms of her Buddhism. That's when it was in 2003. At the end of her Saturn return was when she took vows in the particular lineage of Buddhism that she practices. So it was following Mika's death, like a year later, that she committed to this spiritual practice that she'd been practicing for decades already, but actually took vows of devotion in the tradition. And so that's like an interesting tidbit in terms of a Saturn return story, that in her second Saturn return was both the loss of her partner, but then the leaning into that loss, the deep wisdom of non-attachment that comes from the Buddhist tradition that we can see, that we can perhaps correlate broadly to the 8th house. And I think I actually see that a lot with clients who have either like the ruler of the ascendant in the 8th or the luminary of sect in the 8th, and Meredith Monk has both of those things, an intrinsic understanding of non-attachment, which doesn't mean it's easy, but that there's a gravitation towards that way of understanding the world, and the fact that Buddhism as a practice and meditation as a practice, which, as she said, is like, it doesn't mean it's easy or fun or happy, but that you're accepting it. Which, echoing Drew earlier, I think that's one of the ways we can see that kind of broad bonification from Jupiter overcoming that whole Scorpio 8th house situation.
Yeah, in terms of the timing, that's fascinating. The perfection stuff that you noticed, and I was just kind of like doing it in my head. Also, if we like did the kind of secondary,
I love that you do perfections in your head. My brain doesn't work that way. No. I have to write them out.
If we did like a secondary perfection from like the sect light, then that 12th house perfection during which her partner died was like perfected to the 7th. Which was ruled by that Venus retrograde transit that you noted on like the day of her death. I love that point about like non-attachment being a lesson of the 8th house, because it is this place where control is not possible because there is this like reliance on others. And so like not being attached to an outcome, not being attached to one's own agency, and particularly with like the ruler of the ascendant, like the planet that is one's agency being in the 8th house, it feels very much like that. That's a lesson of her chart, definitely.
I had one more quote related to the, maybe, I mean, I read a lot of interview. I have like 21 pages of notes, but
I love that.
That's absurd. It's absurd.
Y'all, I have like one page in these Sagittarius Mercuries. I can't keep up.
Oh my God, wait. Are there 2 Sagittarius Mercuries in this?
There are, yeah.
Zoom?
Well, so this is something that comes from that 84 interview in Heresies again, that actually I heard, I read years ago at some formative moment after college, maybe early grad school. And then she's said this a lot of times in interviews, but she also said it at the end in the Q&A portion of the live performance that I saw in 2016. And I'm going to read, it's the end of this that she said live, but I'm just going to read this whole thing because I actually feel like it brings together a lot of what I see functioning in her chart in general, but also that 8th house in particular. The interviewer asks her about ambition, and she said the first thing she says is, ambition will be the death of all of us, which, like, Aries ascendant, ruler of the ascendant in the 8th house, ambition will be the death of us all. It's like, okay, great, that feels really clear. And then she goes on and says, because after a while, okay, you've worked for 20 years or 25 years. Okay, so you've got this many grants, this many pieces you've done. You've got this long resume. You have these people that hate you and these people that love you. You've done this piece and that piece and this piece and that piece. And then you go to your grave. And how do you think you have a piece of paper? And what do you think you have? A piece of paper that tells you all these pieces that you've done? So what? The only reason for doing it is that you might have the joy of that kind of discovery on a day-to-day level. The only reason for doing it is really that you love doing it. And I say this very seriously, having gone through a lot of pain, a lot of bitterness, a lot of this and a lot of that, and really, really trying to figure out why I'm doing it. And I really don't see any reason for doing it except that I just love to do it, because otherwise in this universe, it's meaningless. It's fine that some people are enriched by it and that you are giving it in a way, and everything that you have for other people and for your own fulfillment, but still it's pretty meaningless in the overall big scheme of things. What it gets, this is the part that she said live, what it gets down to is, how do you want to spend your time on this earth? And so in addition to, I mean, I think these things go hand in hand, in addition to this kind of intrinsic orientation towards non-attachment and even impermanence of things, not only the album, but just the impermanence of life and this world. The other side of that is then understanding the preciousness of the time that we have on this earth, and asking this question, when you go to your grave, that consciousness of that, you go to your grave, what was it all for? And the secondary question, how do you want to spend your time on this earth? Which I think is another lesson of Meredith Monk's chart, also a lesson from this interview, but like a place that we can correlate the interview with the chart in terms of those 8th house placements, but also some of the third house things in terms of the kind of discovery on a day-to-day level, the regularity of it and the practice of it. And she's talked a lot in different places about the importance of regular practice. Actually, maybe I'll find that really fast because it's super easy. It's from the Believer interview. They ask her about, do you have a daily practice? She said, do you have a daily routine? And she says some things. Well, I guess I'll read it. It's pretty short. She says, my ideal day, like when I'm on retreat or when I'm not on retreat, or no, when I am on retreat or not running around in New York, is to start by meditating. The whole morning is what I would call maintenance. So it's meditating, then physical exercises, vocal exercises, piano exercises, lunch, and then it's usually sitting down and trying to compose work. And the interviewer says, so you're a strong advocate of ongoing practice. And she says, oh, definitely. Discipline, that's the only way. And I was like, well, there's Saturn in your third house talking. That's great. She says, my voice would never have held out all these years if I had not had a teacher who I still work with, and if I had not been vocalizing just about every day. If you don't use it, you lose it, which also feels like a very Saturn thing to say, and also a Saturn in the third house thing to say, but also a very eighth house thing to say of like, how are you making use of what's there? And if you aren't making use of it, then it's no longer yours. Then it passes away. It's like, then that's no longer part of the life that you're actually living. It could have been, but it's not unless you're putting it into practice.
And I really love that quote about ambition. It's totally like anti-angular or something in like a cool way. Like, and it makes me. This is my benefic of sex, Jupiter and Scorpio talking, but like that I mean that martial way of just like, there are many like great poets, like who will say things like, and I tell this to my clients sometimes. It's like there are great poets who will tell you like, go be like the river, go be like the tree and stuff like that. But then there's also, and there's a lot of wisdom, and we can learn from that, and that has its place. But then there's also a different type of poet who is kind of like, you have to come here and be blood, bones, and meats, and then kind of like, there's something about like the experience of like, and that being connected to martial things. It's kind of like almost what C.A. Conrad, a poet I really loved, calls like an extreme presentness. That real kind of like, being so standing in front of like the totality of life just happening. And I don't know, I just think that's like, maybe that's just like the thing about like the Pressionist thing too. It's like, we're here to risk our hearts, and we're here to risk, otherwise like why, and I think that's like an eighth house, the thing that's also like a scorpionic thing. It's kind of like, yeah, like the risk, and kind of the urgency, and the blood moving, and the learning space of like just that extreme attention, right? Yeah.
And like risk not as something to be like calculated and protected against, or like used to model like what we should or should not expect, and how to like prepare ourselves for certain experiences, like in a sort of like neoliberal understanding of risk, but more in terms of like embracing risk, and that people die, and like that life is full of these eighth house experiences that like are not pleasant. And I was thinking about like what you were saying, Michael, about time, and that's actually something that I started thinking of. A way in which I started to think about the eighth house is like time and the limitations of time and expiration. And I think that like what you were kind of pointing to, I think, is the place of limitation of time leading to meaning, and like what you do with your time becomes more valuable because it has limits. And while that is like a Saturnian idea, like someday you're going to die, so like what are you going to do with your time, it also seems like something that we could think of in terms of the eighth house, and that yeah, like what are you going to do, like at the end of the day, like was it meaningful? Yeah, like think about the eighth house as a place where we lose control, but also where we find greater sources of meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I love that you are making the connection, like maybe it's a Saturnian thing, maybe it's an eighth house thing. Luckily in this chart, it's very easily both, because the ruler of Saturn is in the eighth house. So like it's both of those things, at least in this chart. And I love, Oscar, that you brought in the word risk. I'm going to read another Meredith Monk quote. She says, the other thing I try to do very much is to keep myself in a risk situation, which is not what not what a lot of people like to do. Sometimes it makes me mad at myself, which sounds like the malefic contrary to sect ruling the ascendant. Sometimes it makes me mad at myself, especially when that malefic contrary to sect is Mars. I sometimes also am very ambivalent and confused, but then when I go back to myself, go back again to my real self, I think I really do want to try to risk in every show doing something new for myself, even if people can't keep up with that. I just want to try to do that. And that is very much more difficult, and that is much more difficult on the selling marketplace kind of level. But for me, it's the only thing that keeps me going. Frankly, it's the only thing that keeps me alive. So again, this like the intensity of risk, which is maybe different than ambition. I like that you talked about it as like an anti-angular position, but very much an Aries thing of this, like, I'm going to risk, and not only am I going to risk, take the risks, warranted or unwarranted. That's not really the metric with which Aries is going to be measuring those decisions, but that the ruler of Aries is then in the eighth house, that the risk is the thing that keeps me alive. But then also, just to name, because we've been quite philosophical in terms of Meredith Monk's chart, I think, in so far, that in terms of the part that she's saying there, like it's more difficult on the selling marketplace side of things, that the business side of art has actually been quite difficult for her. She says, she describes it that I guess the way that I dealt with it was that I ignored it for a long time, and then it got so bad that I was totally bankrupt and I had to stop ignoring it. I always had the feeling that, which I still have, that one can do business and try to be a good human being be as good a human being as possible at the same time. I really do want to have my integrity and have my own work be the way that I want it to be. And so this kind of like difficult place of like the work, I really want the work to be my way, this way, it has to be this way, which feels very fixed, but also very Aries somehow at the same time. And then the challenges that come with business and income, and the fact that the ruler of her second house, while she has this exalted moon in the second house, the ruler is in antithesis in the eighth house, and bankruptcy being quite literally one of the things that we might see signified by the eighth house. But just the challenge in general, the challenges, and that while even Mars is in its own domicile in the eighth house, it's still the malefic contrary to sect. And the way that we can hold those things together is that she's sharing this story, this history of not really dealing with the business side of things, ignoring it, which feels like an eighth house thing of like, all of that's in the eighth house, I don't really want to look at it, until the point of being totally bankrupt. But of course, we can also see the longevity of her career, that while those challenges may have been true, she's made it work, and she's made it work better than a lot of people in her generation, especially doing the kinds of experimental work that she's done all along, to be able to not only support and sustain herself in multiple homes, but also to like have a company that she pays, that she supports them as well. So so while there have been challenges, there's a lot of mitigation here, especially I guess from the Jupiter overcoming being like a primary source of mitigation in terms of things, but also the moon being exalted in the second house as well. So I just wanted to bring in those two pieces. That's again, that echoing that what Oscar brought in terms of risk, and the risk being literally what keeps her alive. And then also, or figuratively, I don't know, I guess she says, frankly, it's the only thing that keeps me alive. I don't know if that's literal or not. But then also the ways in which that risk has its costs in terms, quite literally, this time is literally in terms of finances and supporting oneself, and the troubles that can come with that.
There's also underneath this Venus, there's Fomalhaut, right? There's a royal star under there due to the Parans, and so I find that really interesting in terms of like, classic delineation for Venus being, fed starlight from Fomalhaut is like, right, the artist figure, like that is very much like that. But then there's also kind of like, it's a royal star, so I find that like a lot of like clients who have like Fomalhaut things, it is kind of like about like disillusionment is like a big enemy, and it's kind of like they're right, they are artists and they are often creative people, but it's just kind of like having to kind of protect that in some sort of way, and it's about sustaining the faith in it. It's a big blessing in a way, like and it speaks to kind of, it's like one of many ways to find that, like, oh, this is a like the chart of an artist. But that's, I just wanted to point that out really quick. It's
Yeah,
like really
that's
like
such a
cool.
it's such a cool star. Like
Mhm.
of all the royal stars, had that sense of like subtle perception
Mhm.
and the poetry to express and like induce that subtle perception in others is like kind of how I think
Mhm.
about that star. I wanted to maybe jump back to the money stuff that
Mm.
Michael was talking about, and I was wondering if I'm sure there's like many reasons that like you know choices that she made that kind of led to those financial situations. I'm curious if part of it was also, or it is also about the way that it's so hard to label like what she is.
Mhm.
And that was a theme in her chart that I was thinking about in terms of her Saturn and Gemini ruling her 10th, where it's like she's always like more than one thing. It's like difficult to call her just a choreographer or just a composer or just, and yes, you can name all of these things, but I think like in the context of like a social context, and Saturn
Mhm.
also rules her 11th, like it's maybe more difficult to travel when one does not have like a steady public identity. So I was wondering like about that theme in her
Mhm.
chart.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. Well, that Saturn falls into what, the first decan?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the apple of Eden, right? It's like the space of Gemini that's so much about like curiosity, and I feel like it's like a really active decan. So it's like, like when things fall in there, I just think of like, yeah, the variety and the constant, like, I don't know, like juggling of many things, and like, I don't know, maybe like, yeah, kind of like a constellating way that that planet will have, where it's like,
In
ooh.
terms of the um, undecidability of her, how to label her, thinking about her work. And she's even said that, like, and this was some of the bitterness that she had to work through at various points, was like, in a lot of the textbooks, I get left out because people don't know, do we put her in a music textbook? Do we put her in a dance history book? That, like, in a lot of places, she doesn't get included because when you're many things, you're also, by some people's accounting, you're not anything. You're no one of those things, because you're not really a composer, you're really a choreographer, but you're also not really a choreographer, you're really a composer, that sort of thing. And even the fact that we didn't have language for what she was doing, there is that Gesamtkunstwerk that I was trying to think of earlier, this like total work, total art situation, but like multimedia, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. Richard Schechner, who was actually one of the founders of performance studies, said before there was performance art, there was Meredith Monk. Like, before we had this genre of performance that we call performance art, there were people already practicing in those ways. We just didn't have a word for them. So I think it's absolutely one of the ways in which her circulation, the way that you were talking about her public circulation, is challenged by the multidisciplinary nature of what she does. And that Gemini speaks to that. Like, yes, I love the Decan imagery that you're bringing in, Oscar, but I think of those things as true for all of Gemini, that Gemini is a mutable sign, and mutables tend to describe something that are in multiple. Regardless of what decan it falls in, that would kind of always be an available
Yeah.
correlation to think, like, the ruler of the 10th is an immutable sign. Will she not only have the initiative, the kind of cardinal qualities of Capricorn, of like starting something and building something, but also doing that by bringing together many different sides of herself, many different disciplines, many different traditions,
Yeah, and
in how she builds that.
I think it's so much, it's mutable, and it's also so mercurial as well. And as an artist who kind of suffered a similar fate as her in terms of like legibility within a particular discipline and like being historicized in a particular way is John Chamberlain, the sculptor, who is, he has his, I just pulled up his chart to remind myself, but his midheaven is ruled by Jupiter in Pisces conjunct Mercury. And so I think there's this confounding quality of like the mercurial influence on the MC that that might bring this like curiosity for sure, and experimentalism and working with all these things, but maybe at the expense of a kind of you know like a linear historicization. Like, I think that's a really
like powerful thing to learn about her chart or about astrology as well, is like the power of Mercury and kind of providing tools, providing innovation, and also sometimes like a difficulty in being read.
On that Mercury, let me see. Is that midheaven falling within the bounds of Mercury, or is it right on the edge?
I don't think we can really do that because of the time.
We don't. Yeah. So the midheaven is not a reliable degree because we don't have the birth
Oh,
time.
right.
But but
Okay.
if this was correct, that would be it would be in the bounds of Jupiter.
Oh, okay.
If using the Egyptian bounds.
Okay, never mind. I don't have it. I didn't prep that, so I was like, oh, okay.
That's totally fine.
Well,
definitely we can say that Saturn rules the 10th. Using this chart, using this chart, we can say that Saturn rules the 10th, and we don't know if it necessarily rules the midheaven.
I was also thinking about the historical kind of like her genesis, like in terms of like when she came about, and this moment in the mid 60s when she kind of like moved to New York. She graduated Sarah Lawrence and started immediately like making art in the downtown scene. This was during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo. And there's so much interesting about this time period that I'm starting to explore in terms of language and different approaches to language, and sort of disrupting conventional approaches to language from both an artistic perspective, but also from like a philosophical and theoretical perspective. The mid 60s, for example, is when Derrida and Barthes both become like really prominent. But her specific kind of the way that she layers her chart layers into this timing is that it's like her third Saturn, or it's her closing Saturn square before her Saturn return. And that closing Saturn square is opposed by this Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And so like this tying in of her life's work to these sorts of like language disruptions, and playing with, playing in the third house, but also like this conjunction takes place in her sixth. And so like the labor that she's doing, and the things that she's fighting for, in some sense, is like a theme that I think of often with the sixth. So that was just a historical point about that conjunction, and the sort of Richard Tarnas writes, he describes that conjunction, not particularly in Virgo, but just that archetypal combination in general, as historical periods included unusually rapid technological advance, an underlying spirit of restless experiment, drive for innovation, urge for freedom in many realms, revolt against oppression, embrace of radical political philosophies, and intensified collective will to bring forth a new world. And so that idea of like restless experiment feels very much like tied in with her rise, and the rise of her work within the scene, and like also the scene in general.
I had one piece I wanted to share about the Mercury, since you mentioned Mercury. We haven't talked much about Mercury today, other than the fact that Mercury is ruling her Saturn. There's a quote that's actually, she's said a version of this many times over the years, but it's her kind of like the moment that she realized what the voice was capable of, that kind of initiated her exploration into what eventually became known as the extended vocal technique. And she says, one day I had a revelatory moment, and I realized I could work with my voice the way that I had with my body. And then just like a little background that she had coordination issues as a child, in terms of her eyes not tracking together. And so one of the ways that her mother brought her into music, even though she was in this already very musical family, was through Dalcroze eurythmics, which is like an embodied practice of like physicalizing the music, physicalizing the rhythm in order to understand it, which I just think is a beautiful expression of the moon in Taurus being like the body is the way in to things. But the body had been part of her music all along. And she says, at Sarah Lawrence, I had worked very hard to create a personal movement vocabulary and an idiosyncratic choreographic style from my own physical rhythms and impulses. That day at the piano, I saw I could literally make a vocabulary built of my own vocal instrument. and that within my voice, there were limitless possibilities of timbre, texture, landscape, character, gender, ways of producing sound. I started widening the ends of my range and experimented with my breath, my diaphragm, vocal gestures such as sighing and whispering, laughing, and various head-body resonances. I found that within one voice are male and female, all ages, shades of feeling that we don't have words for. I was lucky to have the vocal instrument given to me as part that vocal instrument given to me as part of my family legacy. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to name in relation to some of those things that she's describing. One is just a gesture back again to that asteroid Polyhymnia conjunct her Jupiter in the fourth house, and Polyhymnia being the muse of the song, of the sacred song specifically, and being conjunct Jupiter and her specific language of widening the ends of her range and experimenting with the breadth of what was possible. And so this like widening and expanding of the song or the voice. But then in terms of Mercury, that Mercury is conjunct this obscure little asteroid named Misa. And Misa is one of the facets of Dionysus, specifically the feminine and androgynous embodiment of Dionysus, that in the Orphic hymn, let me scroll up in my notes. In the Orphic hymn, she's identified with Dionysus and seems to be a reflection of the female side. The hymn describes, I call upon the sacred and holy, the ineffable queen Misa, whose twofold nature is male and female. And Misa is conjunct her Mercury in the eighth house. And so it's just one of the places where I see this, the voice contains all genders, all ages, things that we can feelings, that the subtle shades of feeling for which we don't have words, and that all of that is contained in the voice, in this voice. And Misa being a gesture towards that, and then also more broadly as a facet of Dionysus, that Dionysus himself is one of in the Greco-Roman pantheon, is a god of, I mean, most often people think of him as a god of like wine and festivity and revelry, which might gesture back to some of the festivity things that Oscar was talking about really early on and what becomes possible in festivity. But also Dionysus was a god of undecidability, of the blurring of boundaries, a god of transitions and contradictions, such that he was both the god of drunkenness, but also sobriety, a warlike god, a violent god, but also a god of peace, a god who was sometimes portrayed as old and sometimes portrayed as young, a god that was sometimes portrayed as male and sometimes portrayed as female. And actually, in addition to ruling wine, he ruled all of the fluids of life, like milk and honey, but also blood and semen. And so there's this fluidity and liquidity and ability to flow across established borders and boundaries that we get with the figure of Dionysus, and by extension by the figure of Misa, who's conjunct her Mercury in the eighth house. So that's just another one of the like interesting little places where there's this thing she talks about all the time in so many interviews about this revelatory moment where she realized what all is included in the voice.
Yeah,
and that's good.
There was a quote, the quote that I love, that it kind of like adds to just an image that she gives where she says the voice, it could be like the body. And so this kind of like metaphor, this metaphorical kind of logic, which is very mercurial. She says the voice could be like the body. It could move like the spine. It could jump. It could turn. It could fall within the voice. And then she goes on to say these things about like this kind of crossing of genders and these experimentations. The point about that Uranus-Pluto conjunction in 1965 is that is the time when she had this revelation about the voice. I just thought that was such a beautiful imagery.
Totally. And I think that that's, for me, another reflection of that moon in Taurus, of that, that the body is the way that she understands things. Even as a musician, even as a composer, even as a vocalist, that her way in is through the body, both in these childhood experiences of eurythmics, but also in this experimental phase of what does it mean for the voice to jump? What does it mean for the voice to slide down? What does it mean for the voice to roll or to spin? And that all of these are physical embodied questions that she's bringing because of her background and expertise in dance as well. And so really thinking about the voice dancing and moving as a body. And that I mean, it's so clear whenever you watch her performance work, whether on video or live, that all the voice is always moving the body, that they're never just sitting there, standing there statically singing. They're always moving with the voice. And then quite literally building gestural phrases, like whole choreographies with the music. And by choreographies, I mean both like sets of movement vocabulary within the individual body, but also composition between multiple bodies in both like the stage performances, but also the site-specific work, whether that was on like multiple locations like Juice and Vessel, or in places like Songs of Ascension, where it's the bodies are moving up and down the tower, but also the voices are moving up and down scales and tonal progressions and things like that. And so we see that embodiment of the voice so clearly in not only in her thinking and talking about it, but also in the enactment, in the performance of the work as well.
There's also a star in Parantor Mercury. It's called Alcyone, and Alcyone is the third eye of the bull. And I mean, there's a lot of things about the star, but one of the things about it is that like often people who have a connection to it love to work with, or love to find a tradition to work within, or kind of they're always looking for like techniques or kind of toolkits. And so I love that quote about the voice, because it's kind of like this moment of like, oh, this could be that. And Alcyone kind of asks of whatever it's touching to become like a discipline, like a very serious, like, you know. And so yeah, I feel like throughout Monk's career, like that the voice has become an entire kind of like the way a painter might have like all of these different brushes, all of these techniques and tools at their disposal. It's like I've made my voice that. And like, I mean, it's funny, like Alcyone to Venus, like I had a client the other day was like a Shakespeare actor, and I was like, that makes sense. It's like there's also something like of a real appreciation for feeling like part of time. And it's like, you know, I have clients who have Alcyone to Mercury, and they say their prayers in Latin, or like really old prayers, because there's something about like, you know, these words arranged in this specific way have passed through the throats of billions of people, you know, behind me, you know. It's like I'm part of that or something. And so there is kind of like this old, like kind of like this old temporal kind of thing going on with Alcyone and the voice. And right, and then kind of like, I mean, what another composer who has that same combination is like Tchaikovsky, who's known so much for like producing I mean, is really renowned for like a lot of like, for many things, but especially for like melody and the composition.
Her Saturn in Gemini is very mysterious in this way, because it like you can think of Saturn as restriction, right? And so like maybe Saturn in Gemini, like a restriction of language, and how like through that restriction she actually produces more in some way, and like the contradictory nature of that move, where she's like using language less, but in so doing she's actually like gesturing to things that are more expansive. And I think there's something very like peculiar and mercurial about that gesture.
There are pieces where like it might only be like a couple people singing, but it feels like it's 50.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've seen Monk work that feels like, I'm like, oh, how many people are actually like singing? And it won't be as many as I think there are. And it's like, right, the canon and the round and all these kind of like cycling techniques that you can do with like performers that can kind of like,
yeah, like the Hocket sounds, the Hocket is two people, but it sounds like it sounds like it must be more than that, because how could two people coordinate their voices in such like in this like very tight kind of in this tight way.
And I love, and you know, that brings me back to Risk too, because I think I love that you named that, because I was like, what is that word for that? That term the whole time. And I was like, has this thing where she says, one thought in the mind and you're out when you do that.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, I mean, it is risky, and it's kind of like, right, you and someone else. So it's kind of like, I mean, that's super 8th house. It's like, ooh, we have to, you know, and she talks about like, I don't know if she says risk explicitly, but she says like, there's a certain like, she's never felt comfortable in that situation with someone else anytime she's done it. And I think I think in the context it sounds like an exciting thing for her.